The galaxy had rules long before humanity ever learned it was not alone. They were not written rules, not etched into stone or encoded into any single law, but everyone knew them all the same. The ancient powers expanded. The young adapted or submitted. The weak survived by usefulness. The stubborn were erased. It was a system that had functioned for tens of thousands of cycles, refined through conquest and precedent until it felt less like a choice and more like gravity itself. No one questioned gravity. You simply learned how to live beneath it. By the time humanity's first faster-than-light signal was detected at the outer edge of charted space, the galaxy had already decided what humans would be. The early reports were unremarkable. A bipedal mammalian species originating from a mid-sized blue planet orbiting a stable yellow star. Average lifespan short by galactic standards, physically fragile. No natural armor, no claws, no venom. Their biology suggested a prey species that had learned tool use as a compensatory strategy. Psychologically volatile, emotionally expressive, prone to internal conflict. In other words, ordinary. The observing empires did not rush to make contact. There was no urgency. Humanity was confined to a single star system, its early interstellar probes clumsy and slow. Their first colonies took decades to stabilize. Their first off-world wars were small, brutal, and instructive to anyone who cared to watch. Humans fought each other far more efficiently than they explored space. This was noted, catalogued, and dismissed as a phase. Young species always fought themselves before they learned their place. When formal contact finally occurred, it was not dramatic. No grand fleets appeared in Earth's skies. No demands were issued. A single diplomatic vessel arrived, broadcast greetings in mathematically derived symbols, and waited. Humanity responded cautiously, then eagerly, then with a barely restrained awe that confirmed every assumption made about them. They wanted to talk. They wanted to trade. They wanted to learn. The galaxy smiled, metaphorically speaking, and welcomed them. For the next 2 centuries, humanity spread outward in a careful, almost timid way. They established colonies along unclaimed routes. They negotiated trade agreements. They sent students, engineers, linguists, and diplomats to alien worlds. They joined economic blocs. They paid tariffs. They complied with regulations written long before they had existed. They never expanded aggressively. They never challenged borders. They never threatened anyone. To the older powers, this confirmed everything. Humans were adaptable, cooperative, useful, and harmless. What no one noticed, or perhaps more accurately, what no one thought worth noticing, was how carefully humans observed everything in return. They watched how fleets moved, how supply lines were structured, how empires communicated across vast distances. They studied the political fractures hidden beneath centuries of stability. They learned which species ruled by fear and which by convenience. They memorized the ways ancient powers reacted to defiance, to submission, to resistance. They listened. They remembered. On Earth, history was not something humanity ever escaped. Every culture carried scars of conquest, occupation, near extinction, and recovery. Humans had destroyed their own civilizations more than once and rebuilt them from ash. They had learned, painfully and repeatedly, that strength alone was not enough, that numbers did not guarantee victory, and that arrogance was often deadlier than any weapon. They had learned that survival favored those who prepared quietly. By the time the Galactic Imperium formally acknowledged humanity as a recognized developing civilization, humans had already mapped the Imperium's logistical doctrine, identified its strategic choke points, and modeled its response patterns to hypothetical rebellion scenarios. They did not do this because they intended war. They did it because they had learned never to assume peace would last. The Imperium, for its part, ruled more than 12,000 star systems and had done so for longer than humanity had possessed agriculture. It was not cruel in the way humans understood cruelty. It was simply vast, hierarchical, and efficient. Species under its control were categorized, taxed, protected, and regulated. Rebellion was rare not because it was impossible, but because it was unthinkable. No one rebelled against the Imperium because no one believed it could fail. When humanity crossed the threshold that transformed them from developing to strategically relevant, the Imperium finally took a closer look. The assessment was swift. Human territory was small. Their fleets were modest. Their colonies were widely dispersed and lightly fortified. Their economy was strong for their size but deeply integrated into larger trade networks they did not control. Militarily, they were competent but unexceptional. Technologically, they were clever but derivative, borrowing and adapting more than inventing. Politically, they were divided. This last point was the most reassuring. The Imperium did not fear humanity. It did not hate them. It barely noticed them at all. When the decision was made to formally incorporate human space, it was framed internally as a bureaucratic necessity, not a campaign. A problem to be solved. A region to be stabilized. The summons to the Grand Assembly was delivered with all the weight of inevitability. Humanity was invited politely, officially, to discuss their future within the galactic order. The language was careful, neutral, generous, even. The humans who received it understood exactly what it meant. They went anyway. The Grand Assembly Hall was designed to intimidate without overt hostility. Its scale dwarfed most species. Its architecture was ancient and immaculate. Delegations entered through separate corridors, each calibrated to their biology and cultural norms, converging into a single vast chamber where the Imperium's authority was made manifest through symmetry, elevation, and silence. Human delegates entered together. They did not wear ceremonial armor or elaborate regalia. Their uniforms were plain, functional, and deliberately understated. There were no visible weapons, no displays of wealth, no attempt to appear larger than they were. They were aware of how small they looked. They stood anyway. The terms presented to them were not unreasonable by galactic standards. Reduction of independent military capacity, shared governance oversight, integration of outer colonies into imperial administration. In return, protection, technological exchange, guaranteed trade access, and a voice, advisory not decisive in broader policy. Many species would have accepted immediately. Many had in the past. The Imperium expected hesitation. It expected negotiation. It expected fear. What it did not expect was the way the human ambassador listened. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. She did not attempt to reframe the discussion. She asked clarifying questions, precise and calm, and took notes. When the presentation concluded, she thanked the assembly for its time. Then she asked a single question. "And if we decline?" The chamber reacted instantly, not with anger but with confusion. Decline was not part of the process. Decline implied a choice that no one else believed existed. The answer she received was carefully worded, but the meaning was unmistakable. Declining would be unfortunate. Humanity would find itself isolated, unprotected, reclassified. The ambassador nodded. She conferred briefly with her colleagues, then looked back toward the elevated throne where the Imperium's authority resided. "Then we decline," she said. There was no speech, no defiance, no dramatic flourish. Just a statement of fact. The humans turned and left. For the first time in centuries, the Grand Assembly Hall did not know how to respond. The Imperium did not declare war immediately. It did not need to. No one had ever walked away from integration before. The assumption was that humanity would reconsider once the implications became clear. Warnings were issued. Trade restrictions were hinted at. Diplomatic pressure was applied through intermediaries. Humanity acknowledged everything and changed nothing. Behind closed doors, imperial strategists began planning a corrective action. Not an invasion, not a crusade, something cleaner. A demonstration. A fleet would enter human space, enforce compliance, and withdraw. Minimal force. Maximum lesson. It was a routine solution. The fleet assembled without fanfare. Hundreds of warships, crewed by veterans of campaigns that spanned generations. Their commanders were confident, experienced, and mildly annoyed that their time was being wasted on what amounted to a training exercise. They crossed into human territory unopposed. The first system they reached was empty, not destroyed. Not abandoned in panic, just empty, stations powered, infrastructure intact, no ships, no people. The second system was the same, then the third. Sensors detected no large-scale evacuation signatures, no refugee traffic, no distress signals. The humans had not fled chaotically. They had simply gone. Imperial commanders dismissed the unease that crept into their reports. Humans were retreating inward, consolidating, preparing to surrender from a position of perceived dignity. It made sense. It fit the model. Supply convoys began to disappear shortly after. At first, it was attributed to navigation errors, then piracy, then mechanical failure. Ships vanished without debris, without signals, without explanation. Communication relays lagged. Orders arrived late or not at all. The fleet tightened formation. Somewhere far beyond Imperial sensor range, human vessels drifted silently, engines cold, hulls masked against detection. Their crews watched data streams scroll past, calm and methodical. This was not a battle. This was execution of a plan 2 centuries in the making. Humanity did not strike command ships first. They did not seek glorious engagements. They targeted logistics, fuel, data. Synchronization. They removed the invisible scaffolding that held a massive force together. Imperial doctrine depended on centralization, on hierarchy, on the assumption that control could be maintained across vast distances through superior coordination. Humans broke that assumption. One ship vanished, then another. Patrols sent to investigate did not return. The fleet commander ordered a withdrawal to defensive positions, but the message arrived fragmented and delayed. Units responded unevenly. When the first Imperial warship exploded without warning, torn apart by weapons that never appeared on sensors, panic spread faster than any command could suppress it. The humans finally spoke then. Their message was simple. You are surrounded. Leave now. The Imperium did not leave. The battle that followed was brief by historical standards and devastating by every other measure. Imperial ships designed for frontal dominance found themselves attacked from vectors they could not track, by enemies they could not see until it was too late. Human vessels coordinated through decentralized networks that adapted in real time, learning and adjusting faster than any rigid command structure allowed. Within hours, the fleet ceased to function as a cohesive force. Some ships surrendered. Some fled blindly. Most were destroyed. The galaxy reeled. News of the defeat spread unevenly at first, filtered through failing communication networks and censored reports. But truth has a way of surfacing, and when it did, it shattered assumptions older than recorded memory. A small, young species had not only resisted the Imperium, they had dismantled it, not through overwhelming force, through patience, through preparation, through an understanding that wars were not won by those who struck hardest, but by those who understood the system they were fighting within and how to break it. Across the galaxy, conquered species watched carefully. So did humanity. They did not press their advantage recklessly. They did not march fleets toward imperial worlds. Instead, they spoke again, calmly, publicly, to everyone. We did not seek this, the human ambassador said. We will not rule you. We will not replace one empire with another. The words were not threats, they were an invitation. For the first time in a very long time, the galaxy realized it had misunderstood humanity completely, and history began to change direction. The Imperium had always believed rebellion began with rage. That assumption had guided their policies for millennia. When species revolted, it was loud. It was violent. It burned itself out quickly, either crushed by superior force or collapsing under its own chaos. Rage was predictable. Rage was manageable. What spread through the galaxy after the destruction of the corrective fleet was not rage. It was certainty. On worlds that had lived under imperial rule for generations beyond counting, people stopped waiting for permission. Governors found their orders ignored. Military garrisons discovered supply manifests altered, then erased. Entire administrative offices went dark overnight, not from sabotage, but from absence. The clerks, technicians, translators, and logistics specialists who made the empire function simply stopped showing up. Many of them were human, No one had ever thought to track them closely. Humans had been everywhere for decades, quietly indispensable. They worked ports, managed inventories, maintained software, optimized shipping routes. They were good at systems, good at redundancy, good at making themselves useful without drawing attention. They had never been numerous enough to seem threatening. Until they were gone. Trade routes collapsed not because they were attacked, but because no one remembered how to run them without the people who had optimized them. Factories stalled because the technicians who understood the idiosyncrasies of ancient machinery had vanished. Financial networks seized because the error correction routines humans had written decades earlier were no longer maintained. The Imperium had conquered worlds. Humanity had infiltrated processes. As planetary economies faltered, local leaders began making decisions independently, at first quietly, then openly. They rerouted resources inward. They refused imperial requisitions. They demanded explanations that never came. The Imperium's central command issued orders faster and faster, each one contradicting the last as the situation spiraled beyond its ability to model. Fleet assets were redeployed reactively, arriving too late, lacking support, dissolving into isolated fragments of power unable to project authority. For the first time in its history, the Imperium was forced to defend everything at once. That meant defending nothing well. On a dozen worlds, protests turned into sieges. On another dozen, long-suppressed cultural councils declared independence and dared the Imperium to respond. Some worlds descended into chaos. Others transitioned with surprising calm, as if they had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. Humanity did not appear in those moments as conquerors. They appeared as mediators. Human diplomats arrived where imperial officials fled. Human engineers restored power grids without demanding allegiance. Human ships escorted refugee convoys without raising flags. Their message was consistent and relentlessly unprovocative. We are not here to rule you. We are here to make sure no one rules you without your consent. The Imperium's leadership watched this unfold with a growing sense of unreality. They had faced enemies before, coalitions, crusades, even rival empires in ages past. Those conflicts followed patterns. There were fronts, objectives, victories, defeats. This had none of that. There was no capital to besiege, no single fleet to destroy. Humanity did not gather its forces into a shape that could be struck. It flowed instead, adapting to each system, each culture, each local reality. Attempts to retaliate only made things worse. Imperial fleets dispatched to suppress unrest arrived to find no unified enemy, only fractured worlds unwilling to comply and supply chains that no longer functioned. When commanders used force, the response was swift and devastating, appearing from nowhere and vanishing before retaliation could be organized. When commanders hesitated, authority evaporated. Entire armadas defected or stood down, unwilling to die for an empire that could no longer feed their families or explain its own collapse. The psychological impact was worse than the material losses. Imperial doctrine had been built on inevitability, the belief that resistance was futile because resistance always failed. Humanity shattered that belief not with propaganda, but with demonstration. They did not overthrow the Imperium. They made it irrelevant. At the heart of the empire, the throne world dimmed as power restrictions were imposed for the first time in living memory. Towers that had never known darkness flickered at night. Food distribution was rationed. Information was censored, then leaked, then censored again as panic spread through the population. The emperor, whose lineage stretched back to the founding of the Imperium itself, sat increasingly alone. Reports arrived daily, each worse than the last. Worlds seceding. Fleets refusing orders. Economies collapsing. Advisors defecting or vanishing. The empire that had once spanned the stars now struggled to project authority beyond its own system. And always, beneath every report, the same unspoken question lingered. How? The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the few surviving commanders of the destroyed fleet was brought before the throne via secure transmission. His wounds were healed. His posture was rigid, but his eyes carried something unfamiliar to the emperor's court. "Milady, they did not beat us by being stronger," the commander said. "They beat us by understanding us better than we understood ourselves." He described the battle in clinical detail, the way human ships anticipated movements before orders were given, the way their networks adapted faster than imperial command cycles, the way every loss seemed anticipated, absorbed, compensated for instantly. "They planned for failure," he said. "We planned for victory." The emperor listened in silence. "Your Majesty," the commander continued, voice steady despite everything, "they are not like us. They do not believe dominance is stability. They believe stability is something you build, reinforce, and protect constantly. They expect collapse, they prepare for it. They survive their own near extinctions by doing so." The transmission ended. For a long time the throne room was quiet. The emperor had been raised on the idea that history moved toward consolidation. That chaos was temporary. That order, once imposed, endured. It was the foundation of the Imperium's identity. Humanity represented a different philosophy entirely. Order was fragile, freedom was costly, and vigilance was the price of survival. The emperor sent a message. It was brief, unprecedented, a request for dialogue. When the human delegation returned to the Grand Assembly Hall, the chamber was nearly empty. There were no crowds, no observers, no spectacle. The architecture remained imposing, but its authority felt hollow now, a relic rather than a warning. The humans entered as they had before, calm, unarmed, unbowed. This time no one spoke to them from above. The emperor descended. He looked older than his years. His movements were slow, his posture diminished. Power had not been taken from him in a single blow. It had eroded grain by grain until he could feel it slipping through his grasp. "You could have destroyed us," he said without preamble. "Why did you not?" The human ambassador regarded him steadily. "Because destruction is easy," she replied. "Living with what comes after is harder." The emperor studied her face, searching for deceit, for triumph, for hatred. He found none. "What do you want?" he asked. "Choice," she said, "for us, for everyone." The terms they presented were radical and restrained at the same time. Recognition of sovereignty, dissolution of forced annexations, a council of equals. Mutual defense pacts entered voluntarily, not imposed, trade agreements rewritten transparently. No reparations, no humiliation. The emperor understood then the deepest wound humanity had inflicted. They had made conquest obsolete. Signing the agreement did not restore his empire. It ended it peacefully, permanently. When the announcement spread across the galaxy, reactions varied. Celebration, fear, uncertainty, hope. On some worlds, ancient flags were raised for the first time in millennia. On others, new governments struggled into existence, awkward and fragile. Humanity assisted where asked and withdrew where not. They did not fill the vacuum. They let others decide what would replace it. Years passed. The galaxy changed. Humanity did not become an empire. It became something stranger and, to many, more unsettling. A species that could wage war with terrifying efficiency and yet chose restraint. A people who remembered every lesson written in blood and refused to repeat them unnecessarily. They were respected, they were watched, they were no longer underestimated. And somewhere deep in humanity's collective memory, older than spaceflight, older than language itself, a truth continued to guide them. Survival was not about being the strongest. It was about knowing who you were, what you would endure, and what lines you would never cross. The galaxy learned that lesson late, but it learned it well. In the decades that followed the dissolution of the Imperium, historians struggled to describe what had replaced it. There was no single successor state, no banner that claimed the void it left behind. Instead, the galaxy entered an era of fragmentation that, paradoxically, proved more stable than the monolithic order that had preceded it. Systems reorganized around regional interests. Old rivalries resurfaced, but without an overriding imperial structure to weaponize them at scale. They burned out quickly or settled into tense coexistence. Humanity watched all of this with cautious distance. They did not retreat inward, but neither did they expand recklessly. Their fleets remained dispersed, mobile, and quiet. Their colonies emphasized self-sufficiency to a degree other species found excessive. Their political structures resisted centralization even as their influence grew. Other civilizations found this unsettling. They had expected humans to claim the mantle of leadership, to impose a new order shaped in their own image. That was how history usually worked. Power, once acquired, demanded expression. Humanity refused. This refusal became its own kind of power. When disputes arose between newly independent systems, humans were invited as arbiters. When trade routes needed protection, human escorts were requested, not because they were the strongest fleet, but because they did not stay longer than necessary. When infrastructure failed on worlds still reeling from imperial collapse, human engineers arrived with modular solutions designed to be dismantled and maintained locally, not controlled remotely. They taught, then left. Some species resented this. They accused humanity of hypocrisy, of hidden dominance, of soft control masked as benevolence. Humans did not argue. They simply pointed to the fact that any world that no longer wanted their presence could ask them to go, and they would. This, more than any victory in war, reshaped galactic psychology. For millennia, power had been synonymous with permanence. The Imperium had ruled because it stayed, it occupied, it endured. Humanity demonstrated a different equation: influence without occupation, strength without ownership. Not everyone trusted it. Not everyone had to. Within human space, the aftermath of the conflict was studied with the same ruthless honesty that had characterized its preparation. No victory was allowed to calcify into myth. Failures were catalogued, near misses analyzed, assumptions challenged. Human academies taught the war not as a triumph, but as a warning. They taught how close everything had come to disaster, how fragile the balance had been, how easily different choices could have led to annihilation rather than transformation. Children learned not that humanity had won, but that it had survived without becoming what it feared. Veterans returned to civilian life carrying experiences few outside their species could fully comprehend. They did not wear medals openly. They did not tell stories unless asked. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, what their restraint had cost. Some nights when the stars were quiet, human commanders replayed simulations of alternative paths, ones where escalation had continued, where restraint had failed, where the Imperium had been burned to ash. They did not like what they saw. Other species noticed something else as well. Humanity did not demilitarize. Its fleets remained formidable. Its technologies continued to advance, often in directions that seemed inefficient to outside observers. Redundancy upon redundancy. Fail-safes layered atop fail-safes. Systems designed to degrade gracefully rather than catastrophically. Human ships carried more life support capacity than required. Human colonies stockpiled reserves beyond economic logic. Human data networks assumed compromise as a baseline, not an anomaly. To the galaxy, this looked like paranoia. To humanity, it was memory. Every human carried within them the inherited knowledge of near extinction, of ice ages and plagues, of wars that had nearly ended their species before it ever reached the stars. They had learned, long before meeting alien life, that progress did not erase vulnerability. It only changed its shape. As centuries passed, the story of the Imperium became legend. Younger species learned of it as a cautionary tale. Older ones spoke of it with something like shame. The name of the emperor faded into obscurity, remembered less for his fall than for the moment he chose not to doom billions by clinging to pride. Humanity did not erase the Imperium from history. They archived it. They preserved records, testimonies, analyses, not to glorify themselves but to ensure no one forgot how inevitability could be an illusion. On the anniversary of the treaty that ended the war, there were no parades in human space, no celebrations. Instead, observatories opened their doors. Lectures were held. Names of the dead, human and non-human alike, were read aloud. The lesson was repeated quietly. This is what happens when dialogue fails. This is what happens when assumptions go unchallenged. Beyond human space, attitudes shifted slowly. At first, species measured humanity by what it had destroyed, then by what it had refused to destroy, eventually by what it consistently protected. The galaxy learned that if humans issued a warning, it mattered. If they offered assistance, it came without strings, and if they withdrew, it was final. No one mistook this for weakness anymore. There were still conflicts, still wars, still horrors humanity could not prevent. They did not claim to be guardians of the galaxy, and they did not pretend they could fix everything. But when humanity spoke on matters of extinction, survival, or coercion, even the most ancient civilizations listened. They had seen what humans did when cornered. They had seen what they chose to do when victorious. And they understood, at last, the nature of the species they had once dismissed. Humans were not special because they were stronger. They were special because they remembered what it felt like to be small, afraid, and defiant all at once, and they never forgot that one day they could be again. So they prepared, quietly, always. Long after the last imperial insignia was dismantled and the last centralized command dissolved into history, analysts across the galaxy continued to debate a question that refused to settle. Was humanity an anomaly or a warning? Some argued that humans were a statistical fluke, a species whose particular evolutionary path and historical trauma had produced an unusually adaptive psychology. Others insisted that what humanity represented was not unique at all, but rather an inevitability that older civilizations had forgotten, that any species capable of reaching the stars carried within it the capacity for both annihilation and restraint, and that the balance between those forces determined its fate. Humanity, for its part, did not participate in the debate. They were busy. The collapse of the Imperium had left behind not just political fragmentation, but infrastructural scars that would take generations to heal. Star lanes once maintained by Imperial mandate required renegotiation. Defense agreements had to be rewritten without coercion. Entire regions lacked reliable communication networks, having relied on centralized systems that no longer existed. Humans assisted selectively, carefully. They provided frameworks rather than blueprints, principles rather than instructions. They shared what they had learned the hard way, that systems should be resilient, decentralized, and transparent to those who depended on them. Some worlds adopted these ideas eagerly. Others rejected them, clinging to hierarchical models out of habit or fear. Humanity did not insist. Time would decide. Within human civilization, the war became less a singular event and more a reference point, a shared boundary between eras. Before, humanity had been a participant in a galaxy shaped by others. After, it was a variable that could not be ignored. This had consequences. Human politics grew more complex, not less. Old divisions did not vanish simply because humanity had faced an external threat. If anything, the scale of what had been survived intensified debates about governance, ethics, and responsibility. Some argued for a more assertive role in galactic affairs, warning that power unused could invite new forms of tyranny. Others argued just as passionately for restraint, fearing that even well-intentioned dominance would corrupt the very principles humanity claimed to uphold. These arguments were loud, messy, and unresolved. That, too, was intentional. Humanity had learned to distrust unanimity. They had seen how easily consensus hardened into dogma, how dissent was framed as disloyalty in empires that no longer remembered why they ruled. Human systems were designed to argue with themselves, to slow decisions through friction, to force justification rather than assumption. To outsiders, it looked inefficient. To humans, it was survival. There were moments when this philosophy was tested. A century after the war, a coalition of systems attempted to recreate something resembling the Imperium, not through conquest, but through economic pressure and security guarantees that quickly edged into coercion. Smaller worlds found themselves trapped in agreements they could not exit without collapse. The galaxy watched to see what humanity would do. Human diplomats engaged first, offering mediation, transparency audits, and alternative trade frameworks. When those offers were rejected, human fleets repositioned, not aggressively but unmistakably. Supply chains were rerouted, critical technologies were withheld, the coalition's expansion stalled. There was no battle, no declaration. The message was understood. Another time, a species on the brink of extinction petitioned humanity for direct intervention against a neighbor whose expansion threatened their survival. Human analysts debated for months. They modeled outcomes. They listened to testimonies. They examined their own biases. In the end, humanity intervened, but not militarily. They evacuated entire populations, relocated them across light years, and dismantled the conditions that made the conflict inevitable. It was expensive, politically unpopular, morally exhausting. They did it anyway. The galaxy learned slowly that humanity did not operate on the logic of convenience. They operated on thresholds. Push hard enough and you would meet resistance that seemed disproportionate, overwhelming, and utterly final. Respect autonomy, and humanity would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure it remained intact. This unpredictability unsettled older species accustomed to rigid hierarchies and fixed responses. They preferred enemies they could provoke, rivals they could outmaneuver. Humanity was neither. They were patient but not passive, peaceful but not harmless, cooperative but not compliant. And always, beneath every interaction, there lingered the unspoken memory of what happened the last time someone assumed they could be bent without consequence. In academic circles, a new term emerged: the human constraint. It referred to the phenomenon where potential aggressors altered their behavior not because humanity had issued threats, but because they could not reliably predict how far humanity would go once certain lines were crossed. Unlike empires that telegraphed their limits through doctrine and precedent, humanity's limits were ethical, not territorial. That made them harder to game. Human military academies taught this explicitly. They trained officers not just in tactics but in restraint, emphasizing that the most dangerous moment in any conflict was the one immediately after victory, when power tempted excess. "Winning is easy," one oft-quoted instructor said. "Stopping is hard." As centuries passed, humanity became something close to a constant in galactic affairs. Not a ruler, not a judge, but a stabilizing presence whose influence was felt more in crises than in calm. They never forgot that this position had been earned not through destiny, but through choice. And they never forgot how close they had come to choosing differently. There were memorials scattered across human space that marked no single battle or hero. Instead, they commemorated moments of decision. Transcripts of debates, records of votes, simulations that had ended in annihilation rather than peace. Visitors from other species often found these memorials confusing, even unsettling. Humans found them necessary, because the galaxy, for all its vastness, was still a place where fear could drive civilizations to terrible acts, where pride could justify cruelty, where strength could masquerade as right. Humanity did not believe itself immune to these impulses. They believed only that awareness made resistance possible. In the end, that was the lesson humanity offered the galaxy, not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as survivors. Power was inevitable. What mattered was what you remembered when you held it. There came a time when a generation reached adulthood that had never known the Imperium as a living force. To them, it was a concept taught in history modules, a case study dissected in political science courses, an example cited in ethical debates about centralized authority and systemic fragility. They knew the outlines of the war the way one knows the outlines of an ancient disaster, intellectually, abstractly, without the visceral weight that had shaped those who lived through it. Humanity worried about this. Not because they feared forgetting the Imperium itself, but because they feared forgetting the feeling of inevitability that had once pressed down on them like a physical force. The sensation of being judged small, manageable, temporary. The quiet terror of knowing that survival depended not on strength, but on whether someone older and larger decided you were worth keeping. Humans knew how easily memory softened with time, so they adapted the way they taught. Instead of glorifying the war, they emphasized the years before it, the compromises, the trade agreements signed under unequal terms, the moments when resistance would have been easy and catastrophic, and patience had been chosen instead. They taught how close humanity had come to being absorbed quietly, painlessly, erased not by violence but by relevance. Students studied the psychology of empires, the way systems convinced themselves they were benevolent, the language used to justify domination, the metrics that reduced living civilizations to percentages and projections. They studied themselves just as closely. Why had humanity prepared instead of submitting? Why had they refused to become an empire in return? Why had restraint felt not like weakness but like victory? There were no simple answers. That uncertainty was preserved deliberately. Beyond human space, similar questions began to emerge in other civilizations. Species that had once measured success in territory and tribute began experimenting with different models. Confederations formed that prioritized mutual withdrawal clauses. Defense pacts included explicit dissolution triggers. Cultural exchange replaced enforced assimilation in some regions. Not everywhere. There were still those who longed for the clarity of dominance, for borders that did not move unless forced, for certainty imposed from above. Occasionally, those longings coalesced into something dangerous. When they did, humanity noticed. One such moment began on the far edge of the former imperial core, where a militarized alliance of systems began consolidating power through protective integration. The language was careful, the intentions on paper benign, but patterns repeated. Smaller worlds lost autonomy. Fleets grew disproportionately large. Information became centralized. Human observers flagged the development early. They did not intervene. Not yet. Instead, they watched, they listened. They offered alternatives that were politely declined. They tracked rhetoric shifts, military exercises, economic leverage points. They modeled trajectories that ended in coercion and collapse. When the alliance crossed its first irreversible threshold, annexing a system against the expressed will of its population, humanity acted, not with fleets, with exposure. Records were released. Not selectively, not manipulatively, but comprehensively. Economic data, internal communications, military planning documents, all authenticated, all contextualized. The galaxy watched as the alliance's public narrative unraveled under the weight of its own contradictions. Some systems withdrew immediately. Others hesitated. The alliance attempted to suppress the fallout, tightening control, accelerating timelines. That was the second threshold. Human fleets repositioned then, visible and silent. Trade agreements were suspended. Critical technologies became unavailable. Nothing was announced. Nothing was threatened. The alliance collapsed within a year. Afterward, a representative from one of the former member systems asked a human diplomat a question that echoed through later discourse. Why not stop it sooner? The diplomat answered without hesitation. Because stopping something too early teaches the wrong lesson. People need to see patterns complete before they believe they are real. This approach unsettled many. Humanity was not reactive enough for some, not decisive enough for others. They were accused at various times of moral arrogance, strategic coldness, and quiet manipulation. Humans accepted the criticism. They had learned that being understood was not a prerequisite for being effective. What mattered was outcome. Over time, a subtle shift occurred in how the galaxy conceptualized conflict. Wars became shorter, less total. Occupations became rarer. The cost-benefit calculations that once favored expansion now included variables that were difficult to quantify: human attention, human response, human thresholds. Even species that distrusted humanity adjusted their behavior around these unknowns. This was not fear. It was caution. Humanity never corrected those who misunderstood them. They did not clarify their doctrines publicly. They allowed myths to form and decay. Predictability, they believed, was a liability. Privately among themselves, humans debated constantly. There were moments when restraint felt like failure, when suffering elsewhere gnawed at consciences already burdened by the knowledge of what humanity could do if it chose to. There were nights when commanders stared at star maps and imagined decisive interventions that would end crises swiftly and permanently. They remembered then how easy that path had once seemed, and how close it had come to consuming everything. In the end, humanity's greatest legacy was not the fall of an empire, but the normalization of refusal. The idea that no civilization, no matter how ancient or powerful, was entitled to obedience simply because it had always received it. That idea spread quietly. It appeared in treaties, in constitutions, in the way smaller systems spoke to larger ones, in the assumption that consent mattered even when it was inconvenient. The galaxy did not become peaceful, it became less resigned, and in that difference lay everything. Humanity remained what it had always been since the day it stepped into the stars, a species shaped by loss, driven by memory, unwilling to surrender agency to inevitability. They did not claim the galaxy. They reminded it that it belonged to no one. And if someday humanity fell, as all civilizations eventually did, they hoped the lesson would remain, carried forward by those who had watched them choose patience over panic, restraint over revenge, and survival over dominion. Because strength fades, empires end, but the memory of a choice can outlast both. There was a quiet moment, centuries after the war, when humanity came closer to losing its way than it ever had during open conflict. It did not arrive with fleets or ultimatums. It arrived with comfort. Human space prospered, trade flowed freely, borders stabilized. Generations grew up without fear of annihilation hanging over every strategic calculation. The vigilance that had once been instinctive began to feel excessive to some, expensive, obstructive. Why maintain such large reserves? Why keep fleets dispersed instead of consolidated? Why design systems to survive collapse when collapse seemed increasingly unlikely? These questions were not asked by fools. They were asked by capable leaders, economists, engineers, people who genuinely believed humanity could afford to relax. History, after all, had been rewritten in humanity's favor. That frightened the elders more than any enemy ever had. In closed councils, veterans of the Imperium conflict spoke less frequently, but when they did, rooms went silent. They did not argue with passion. They simply described scenarios. What happens when redundancy is removed? What happens when efficiency replaces resilience? What happens when you assume tomorrow will resemble today? They had seen those assumptions before. Human governance systems responded the only way they knew how, by institutionalizing doubt. Emergency authorities were reviewed and weakened rather than strengthened. Oversight expanded. Simulations of catastrophic failure were mandated and published, not classified. Some citizens hated it. It felt pessimistic, paranoid, a refusal to enjoy the peace that had been earned. But humanity remembered something the galaxy often forgot. Peace was not a reward. It was a condition that required maintenance. The test came from outside human space. A coalition of species, young, ambitious, technologically advanced, rose rapidly along the galactic periphery. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They offered mutual advancement, shared research, pooled defense. Participation was technically voluntary. Those who declined found themselves economically isolated. It was elegant, efficient, bloodless. Human observers noted familiar patterns. The coalition grew faster than models predicted. Its rhetoric emphasized unity, destiny, and shared purpose. Dissenting voices were marginalized for the good of all. Defensive capabilities expanded at a rate that exceeded any plausible threat environment. Humanity requested transparency. The coalition declined politely. For decades, the situation hovered at the edge of intervention thresholds. Humanity argued internally. Some insisted this was not the Imperium reborn, merely a natural alliance pursuing its interests. Others warned that inevitability was taking shape again, quietly, attractively. The galaxy watched humanity watch. Eventually, a member world attempted to withdraw. It was not permitted. No invasion followed. No bombardment. Instead, trade routes were closed. Data access revoked. Infrastructure dependencies activated. Within months, the withdrawing world faced humanitarian collapse. That was the moment humanity intervened openly for the first time in generations. Not with warships, with evacuation corridors. Human fleets appeared along the coalition's borders, broadcasting neutral humanitarian access zones. They escorted civilian vessels, ferried populations, dismantled dependency structures piece by piece. The coalition protested, accused humanity of interference, of destabilization, of neo-imperialism. Humanity responded publicly calmly. "You may build alliances," the statement read. "You may pursue unity. You may not trap populations through coercive dependence." The coalition escalated economically. Humanity absorbed the impact. Then the coalition escalated militarily. Humanity did not. They did something worse. They disengaged. Human trade withdrew entirely from coalition space. Shared research ceased. Navigation support ended. Technical assistance vanished. Humanity did not sabotage. They did not attack. They simply stopped propping up systems that had quietly come to rely on them. Within a decade, the coalition fractured under its own weight. No war had been fought, but the message echoed across the galaxy. Humanity would not allow inevitability to return, no matter how politely it was presented. Afterward, a historian from a neutral world summarized the era in a single line that became widely quoted. "The humans did not defeat empires. They made empire building exhausting." As time passed, humanity's role became less visible but more deeply embedded. Their philosophies influenced governance models. Their insistence on exit clauses became standard. Their refusal to centralize power reshaped how civilizations planned for the long term. They were no longer the protagonists of galactic history. They were its constraint. This suited them. Humanity never sought to be remembered as heroes. Heroes were mythologized, simplified, eventually ignored. They preferred to be remembered as inconvenient, as the species that asked uncomfortable questions, as the ones who refused shortcuts, as the ones who never forgot how fragile everything was. In the deep archives of human space, sealed records remained, plans never used, weapons never deployed, scenarios humanity hoped would never become necessary. They were reviewed periodically, updated and locked away again. Not out of fear, out of responsibility, because humanity understood something the galaxy was still learning. The moment you believe catastrophe is impossible is the moment you stop preparing for it. And humanity had survived too much to ever make that mistake again. In time, the question of humanity's intention stopped being asked aloud, not because it was answered, but because everyone realized it never would be in any simple way. Humanity did not issue manifestos. It did not codify a grand galactic philosophy. It did not claim moral authority beyond its own choices. Instead, it behaved consistently enough that patterns emerged, even if motives remained opaque. Where autonomy was respected, humanity was cooperative to the point of generosity. Where coercion appeared, humanity became obstructive, patient, and relentless. Where extinction loomed, humanity acted, sometimes at enormous cost, sometimes in ways no one expected. The galaxy adapted to this rhythm. Entire diplomatic disciplines arose around interpreting human silence. Analysts debated whether the absence of a response signaled approval, deliberation, or quiet preparation. More than one aspiring hegemon abandoned expansionist plans simply because they could not determine where humanity's thresholds lay. This uncertainty was not accidental. Humanity had learned that deterrence did not require omnipresence. It required credibility paired with restraint. Anyone could threaten destruction. Only a few could demonstrate the ability to stop when destruction was easiest. Human military doctrine evolved accordingly. The emphasis shifted further away from decisive battles and toward shaping environments. Control of narratives mattered less than control of outcomes. Victory was defined not by flags raised or territory seized, but by the absence of future conflicts in the same form. This philosophy frustrated allies and enemies alike. Some accused humanity of moral ambiguity. of hiding behind process to avoid responsibility. Others accused it of manipulation, of engineering circumstances while pretending neutrality. Humans accepted both accusations. They knew what they were capable of. Within human culture, stories changed as well. Early post-war fiction had glorified the collapse of the imperium, often indulging in imagined scenarios of overwhelming force and righteous domination. Over time, those stories fell out of favor. They were replaced by quieter narratives, of near misses, of mistakes narrowly avoided, of ordinary individuals making unremarkable decisions that prevented catastrophe. Children learned about the war not through tales of heroism, but through simulations where there were no perfect choices, only trade-offs. They learned that survival often depended on refusing the most emotionally satisfying option. This did not make them softer. It made them precise. The galaxy would test that precision again. It always did. A century after the coalition's collapse, a signal was detected beyond the known spiral arms. It was old, degraded, and unmistakably artificial. Analysis suggested it originated from a civilization that predated even the Imperium, one that had collapsed long before humanity reached the stars. Exploration vessels were dispatched from multiple powers. Humanity sent one ship. It arrived last. What the explorers found was not an enemy but a warning, an automated archive documenting the rise and fall of a civilization that had unified its galaxy through perfect efficiency. No dissent, no redundancy, no tolerance for deviation, every system optimized. When something unforeseen occurred, there had been no flexibility left. The collapse had been total. Human archivists studied the data carefully, then released it without commentary. No conclusions, no recommendations, just the record. The effect was profound. For many species, it was the first time they saw their own ambitions reflected so clearly in another's extinction. For humans, it was confirmation of something they had long suspected. The universe did not reward perfection. It rewarded adaptability. As exploration pushed farther outward, humanity remained cautious. They expanded slowly, deliberately, maintaining the same principles that had guided them since the Imperium's fall. No colony was founded without the capacity to survive isolation. No alliance was entered without a clear exit. No technology was deployed without consideration of misuse. To some, this seemed like stagnation. To humanity, it was continuity. There were moments of doubt, even among humans. Moments when the galaxy seemed stable enough that vigilance felt unnecessary. Moments when younger generations questioned why so much effort was spent preparing for disasters that never seemed to arrive. The elders never scolded them. They simply asked them to study history, not just human history, all of it. Every empire that believed it had solved governance. Every civilization that believed its dominance was permanent. Every system that optimized away the very traits that allowed it to survive surprise. Humanity did not claim to be wiser. They claimed only to be more afraid of forgetting. In private moments, some humans wondered whether their species had become defined too strongly by its trauma, whether the shadow of the Imperium still loomed larger than necessary, whether caution had hardened into habit. These questions were never fully resolved, but humanity preferred unresolved questions to unquestioned assumptions, and so the galaxy moved forward, shaped subtly but indelibly by a species that refused to fit the roles history had prepared for it. Neither conqueror nor savior. Neither tyrant nor martyr, just present, watching, preparing, because humanity had learned something the galaxy could not unlearn once shown. The most dangerous moment in any civilization's life is not when it is weak. It is when it believes it no longer needs to be careful. And humanity, for all its power, never allowed itself that luxury. There was an irony that only became apparent with enough distance. Humanity had shattered the illusion of inevitability across the galaxy, yet within its own civilization, inevitability remained the most carefully guarded enemy. Not an external one, not an empire or coalition or forgotten precursor, but the quiet, seductive belief that humanity's way of thinking was permanent. That belief was fought constantly. Human institutions were designed to decay on purpose. Charters expired unless renewed. Councils dissolved and reformed under new frameworks. Long-standing organizations were periodically forced to justify their existence from first principles, not precedent. No structure was allowed to say, "This is how we have always done it," without being challenged. To outsiders, it looked chaotic. To humans, it was hygiene. They remembered too well how easily stability became stagnation, how effortlessly confidence became blindness. The imperium had not fallen because it was evil. It had fallen because it was certain. Humanity refused certainty. This refusal shaped even their language. Words like destiny and manifest fell out of official use. Policy documents avoided absolutes. Strategic projections always included failure states, not as footnotes but as central considerations. Human commanders were trained to assume they were wrong. This, more than any weapon, unsettled those who watched them. The galaxy continued to evolve. New species emerged into interstellar awareness, wide-eyed and uncertain in ways humanity recognized instantly. First contact teams were gentle, patient, and relentlessly honest. No promises of protection, no warnings of doom, just facts. This is the galaxy. This is what has happened before. This is what you should understand if you want to survive it. Some listened. Some did not. Humanity accepted both outcomes. They had learned that salvation imposed was just another form of domination. Centuries passed, measured not in wars but in adaptations. The galactic map stabilized into something fluid rather than rigid. Power waxed and waned regionally. No single civilization ever again reached the scale of the Imperium, not because it was impossible but because it was no longer efficient. The cost of empire had become too high. Humanity's presence ensured that. And yet, for all their influence, humans remained deeply aware of their own fragility. Their biology had not changed. Their lifespan was still short by galactic standards. Their bodies were still vulnerable. Their world still required delicate balance to remain habitable. They compensated not with arrogance but with preparation. When new technologies emerged, reality manipulation, deep time engineering, self-directed evolutionary systems, humanity approached them with a hesitation others found frustrating. They tested. They sandboxed. They restricted. They remembered the precursor archive. They remembered themselves. Other civilizations raced ahead, intoxicated by possibility. Some succeeded spectacularly. Others collapsed just as spectacularly. Humanity observed, assisted when asked, and recorded everything. It was said, half-jokingly, that humans were the galaxy's archivists. They did not deny it, because archives were memory, and memory was defense. There was one final moment, long after the Imperium had faded into academic abstraction, when humanity's philosophy was tested in a way no one could have predicted. It did not come from within the galaxy, it came from beyond it. The signal arrived without warning, a distortion in the fabric of spacetime that defied known physics. It was not hostile, it was not communicative. It simply existed, expanding slowly, altering the constants of reality as it spread. Panic followed. Civilizations scrambled for explanations, for weapons, for meaning. Some declared it an invasion. Others called it a natural phenomenon. Fleets were mobilized against an enemy that could not be seen. Humanity did not mobilize fleets. They mobilized historians, physicists, philosophers, biologists, and sociologists. They treated the phenomenon not as an enemy, but as an unknown. The galaxy watched in disbelief as humanity refused to attack, refused to flee, refused to declare destiny or doom. They studied. They shared data openly. They invited collaboration from species that had never trusted each other before. The phenomenon slowed. Then it stabilized. Then it changed course. It did not avoid humanity specifically. It avoided regions of dense interaction, of overlapping systems, of dynamic adaptation. It drifted instead toward emptier, more rigid structures where it caused catastrophic failure. No one ever proved intent, but the conclusion was unavoidable. Adaptation mattered. The galaxy survived. Afterward, no statues were built, no declarations issued. Humanity simply updated its models and moved on, but something subtle changed. For the first time, the galaxy began to see humanity not as a check on power, not as a constraint, but as a participant in something larger, a shared experiment in survival. Humanity never claimed credit. They never did. They had learned long ago that survival was a collective act, even when fought alone. And so the story of humanity spread not as legend, but as precedent. A species that had been underestimated. A species that had prepared without provoking. A species that had won without conquering. A species that had remained dangerous without becoming cruel. In the end, the galaxy did not remember humanity for the fleets they destroyed or the empires they dismantled. It remembered them for a quieter, more unsettling reason. Humanity had proven that strength did not have to announce itself. It could wait. It could watch. And when necessary, it could act with a precision born not of dominance, but of memory. And that, more than any weapon, ensured that the galaxy would never again mistake patience for weakness. As millennia accumulated and individual lifetimes blurred into statistical noise, humanity's presence became something like background radiation, always there, rarely noticed directly, but impossible to ignore when removed. Civilizations rose that never interacted with humans at all, existing on the far edges of known space, developing along trajectories untouched by human trade or diplomacy. Even there, echoes of human-influenced norms appeared: exit clauses, distributed authority, cultural suspicion of centralized inevitability. Ideas propagated faster than fleets ever had. No one could trace those influences cleanly. That, too, was part of the legacy. Humanity did not export ideology in the traditional sense. There were no missionaries, no universal doctrines. Instead, humans exported tools, legal frameworks, risk models, failure analyses, things that encouraged others to ask their own questions rather than adopt human answers. Some species embraced this eagerly, reshaping themselves in ways humans found admirable and strange. Others adapted selectively, keeping their hierarchies but softening their edges. A few rejected everything outright, convinced that humanity's influence was a slow erosion of identity. Humanity allowed all of it. They had learned that survival did not require uniformity. Within human space, the question of legacy eventually became unavoidable. Younger generations, born into a galaxy that no longer threatened them existentially, began asking why humanity still defined itself by a war fought in deep antiquity. Why the Imperium, long gone, still shaped policy debates. Why caution remained a virtue when opportunity seemed endless. These were not rebellious questions. They were healthy ones. Human society did not suppress them. It amplified them. Universities hosted debates spanning decades. Simulations were open to public scrutiny. Archived contingency plans were declassified, allowing anyone to see just how close humanity had come to annihilation at various points. The effect was sobering. Many emerged from that exposure shaken, newly aware of how thin the margin had been. Others remained unconvinced, arguing that humanity had grown beyond those dangers. Both groups were correct in different ways. Humanity had grown stronger. It had not grown invulnerable. That distinction mattered. When humanity finally revised its foundational interstellar accords, documents that had governed its external behavior since the Imperium's fall, the changes were subtle. No expansion of authority. No declaration of leadership. Instead, a refinement of principles. Non-coercion was reaffirmed. Autonomy was clarified. Intervention thresholds were defined more transparently, not to make them predictable, but to make them accountable. For the first time, humanity codified something it had long practiced implicitly: the obligation to step back. If humanity's involvement in a region began to shape outcomes more than local agency did, it was required to withdraw, even if its intentions were benevolent. Influence, humans decided collectively, was not justified by good outcomes alone. This decision was controversial. Some argued it weakened humanity's ability to prevent suffering. Others argued it was the only way to ensure humanity never became the thing it had once resisted. The compromise was imperfect. That, too, was intentional. As epochs passed, the galaxy's memory of the Imperium faded almost entirely. It became a reference point only scholars and philosophers invoked. Humanity's own role in its collapse was no longer common knowledge outside academic circles. Humanity did not correct this. They did not need recognition. They needed continuity. Every few centuries, when a new civilization reached the stars and encountered humanity for the first time, the same pattern repeated. Initial curiosity, then confusion, then often disappointment. You don't rule anything, newcomers would say. You don't enforce order. You don't even seem to want power. Humans would respond with variations of the same answer. We've tried wanting it. Sometimes that answer was understood immediately. Sometimes it took centuries. Humanity did not mind waiting. They had become very good at it. In the end, the galaxy never became safe. No galaxy ever did. Entropy ensured that complexity would always breed risk, that life would always flirt with its own extinction. But the galaxy became survivable, not because of a single species, but because one species had demonstrated again and again that survival was not about dominance, inevitability, or perfection. It was about remembering failure without being paralyzed by it. It was about preparing without provoking. It was about acting decisively when necessary and knowing when not to act at all. Humanity did not save the galaxy. They reminded it how not to destroy itself. And long after humans themselves eventually faded, whether through evolution, transcendence, or some unknown future, the systems they had influenced would continue to ask the same quiet, dangerous question that humanity had asked of itself since the beginning. What happens if we are wrong? As long as that question was asked sincerely, the galaxy would endure. And that, in the end, was the most human thing of all.